Before I finished unloading the truck, a man I'd never met walked across my yard carrying a red gas can like he belonged there. He stopped beside the moving trailer and asked if my mower took mixed fuel or regular. I told him I didn't own a mower yet. He nodded once like that complicated something. Then he said, "You will," and kept walking toward the neighboring property without introducing himself. At the time, I figured small towns were probably just more casual about boundaries. I'd moved to Belmere 3 hours earlier. Around sunset, somebody knocked on the front door. Not rang. Knocked. A woman named Denise stood there holding a casserole dish wrapped in a towel. Mid-60s, maybe, gray hair tied up with a pencil. She introduced herself like we'd already met once before. "Chicken and rice," she said. "The church ladies rotate meals for new arrivals till they get settled." I told her that was nice of them. She asked where I attended services. I said I didn't really. And there was this tiny pause. Not rude, just noticeable enough that I remember it now. Then she smiled again and said, "Well, folks land where they're supposed to eventually." I wasn't sure what that meant. I still ate half the casserole standing at the kitchen counter around 9 o'clock that night, because I hadn't unpacked plates yet. The next morning, I woke up to tire tracks in my gravel driveway. At first, I thought somebody had turned around there overnight. Then, I noticed the leaves piled neatly along the ditch beside the road. Somebody had cleared them while I was asleep. There was no note. I walked into town later for coffee because Belmere's downtown was only 4 blocks long if you counted the pharmacy. The girl at the cafe looked up before I ordered and said, "You're the new man from Arizona, right?" I said, "Yeah." She nodded toward the pastry case. "Miss Denise said you liked pecan pie." I actually don't like pecan pie very much. I think I said that or started to. But the slice was already on a plate by then, and the cafe only had 3 occupied tables. So correcting her suddenly felt like making everybody do extra work. So I ate the pie. A little before noon, somebody named Randall stopped by the table and asked if I'd settled on internet service yet. Because the north side of town lost connection every time it rained hard. He wrote a number on a napkin for a guy who actually showed up when he said he would. Then another man asked if I fished. Then another one asked if I'd ever driven on mountain roads in ice. By the time I walked home, I realized I'd spoken to more people in 3 hours than I had in the previous 3 months in Phoenix. And honestly, at first, it felt good. That first week, people kept appearing at the house for reasons that almost made sense. One guy brought leftover lumber because he'd noticed the porch rail wobble. A teenager I'd never met replaced the bulb over my side door while I was at the hardware store. Denise texted me Wednesday morning, asking if I preferred chili mild or spicy before I'd even saved her number properly. The town moved like privacy just wasn't something people worried much about anymore. I remember sitting on the porch one evening, watching fog come down off the lake while somebody's dog barked somewhere down the road. I had a paper plate balanced on my knee from another church dinner. I hadn't meant to attend that long. Across the street, an older couple waved at me from their driveway like they'd known me years already. And for a minute, honestly longer than a minute, I thought maybe I'd finally found the kind of place people always pretend still exists. By November, I'd stopped being surprised when people walked into my yard without texting first. Belmere didn't really operate on that kind of spacing. Folks crossed property lines the way people in Phoenix crossed hallways. Casual, like movement itself was permission enough. One Tuesday morning, I opened my front door holding half a piece of toast and found a man crouched under my truck with a socket wrench. I just stood there for a second. He slid himself back out, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "Rear bracket was loose." Then he nodded toward the passenger tire. "You're gonna want that replaced before winter." I asked how long he'd been under there. 20 minutes, maybe. Like that was a completely normal answer. His name was Colin. I learned that later at the diner when somebody else pointed him out across the room. He owned the tire shop outside town near the feed store. Apparently, he'd noticed the wobble while I was parked outside the pharmacy 2 days earlier. That kind of thing kept happening. After a while, I realized people noticed almost everything. If my porch light stayed on past midnight, somebody asked the next morning if I was sleeping okay. If my truck wasn't in the driveway, somebody usually knew where I'd gone before I got back. One afternoon, Denise stopped me outside the post office and asked if my sister had made it home safe after visiting. I hadn't told Denise my sister visited. Then I remembered Mrs. Carver across the road had waved at us while we loaded her suitcase. That was how information moved there. Nobody seemed to mean anything by it exactly. It just traveled fast. A storm passed through the second week of November and knocked power out across half the county. I woke up around 3 a.m. because the bedroom had gone cold. By sunrise, somebody had already rolled a generator onto my porch. No note again. Just a full gas can sitting beside it. I found out later it belonged to a guy named Mitch, whose brother worked nights with the county utility crews. Mitch told me not to worry about returning it quickly, because that's what neighbors are for. Then he dropped off split firewood 2 days later after noticing I'd been buying those fake Duraflame logs at the grocery store. I tried paying him for the wood. He looked almost embarrassed. "Just come by Friday," he said. "For what, potluck at the rec hall?" I ended up going because not going suddenly felt stranger than going. That happened more and more. Belmere always seemed to need something from everybody. Church breakfasts, chili cook-offs, school raffles, cleanup days. Somebody hauling wood before rain came in. Somebody needing chairs moved across town. Near the diner entrance, there was a white volunteer board somebody updated every morning with dry erase markers. Church breakfast set up, lake cleanup shifts, Founders Day parking crews. One corner still had a ghost outline where somebody never fully erased an old Christmas toy drive from December. By the time I got coffee most mornings, half the slots already had names beside them. Nobody stood around studying it dramatically or anything. People just glanced at it while waiting for refills the same way offices check schedules or airports check departures. After a while, I started checking it too without really thinking about it. At first, it felt good being expected somewhere. After Phoenix, where nobody noticed if you disappeared for weeks, that kind of attention almost felt healthy. At least that's how it felt then. Around Thanksgiving, Denise started asking me the same question every few days. "You coming tonight?" Sometimes tonight meant bingo at the church basement. Sometimes it meant stew. Night at the volunteer fire station. Once it meant sitting on folding chairs outside the high school football field. while people passed around crockpots under blankets. Nobody pressured you exactly. They just seemed genuinely surprised when you weren't there. The first time I skipped one, I noticed it immediately the next morning at Harlan's Diner. Not hostility, that's the thing. Nobody acted mad. But conversations shortened around me. People still smiled, still poured coffee, still asked how I was settling in. Only now there'd be this tiny pause after my answer, like everybody was waiting for something else I hadn't provided. I remember Randall asking everything all right last night. I said, "Yeah, just tired." He nodded slowly. Then he looked down at his ex for a second too long. That was the whole interaction. But it sat with me anyway. A few days later, Denise asked if I could help at the church fundraiser wrapping canned food boxes. I told her I had paperwork to catch up on from my old consulting job, which was true technically. Mostly I just wanted a quiet evening. Her expression didn't change much. She said, "Well, maybe next time." But after that, she stopped texting smiley faces at the end of messages. I noticed that, which bothered me because I wasn't sure why I noticed it. December came in wet and cold. The lake looked almost metallic some mornings. I started spending more time at the diner because the house got too quiet during rainstorms. One afternoon, I walked in and the room went sort of soft around the edges, conversation-wise. Not silent, just adjusted. Then I realized they were talking about the lake cleanup scheduled for Saturday. Randall asked if I'd signed up yet. I said I probably wouldn't make it. He looked confused more than offended. Town's been doing it 26 years. I told him I had some things around the house. He nodded once. Sure. Then somebody changed the subject to propane prices. That Saturday, my driveway stayed empty almost the entire day. Monday morning, somebody had erased 3 names off the volunteer board near the diner. Mine was still written there in blue marker beside lake cleanup. No random drop-bys, no wave from passing trucks. Even the teenager who usually cut through my yard walking home from school took the long way around. By Sunday afternoon, the normal rhythm came back like nothing happened. Mitch stopped by with venison sausage wrapped in butcher paper. Denise asked if my gutters were draining all right after the storm. Everything looked normal again, which honestly felt stranger than if somebody had argued with me. A week before Christmas, I ended up at a craft fair in the elementary school gym because Denise said the Booster Club needed more bodies walking around or vendors got discouraged. I was standing near a table selling homemade candles when an older woman named Evelyn started talking to me about Belmere winters. She had one of those soft voices that make people lean closer without realizing it. She asked how long I planned on staying. I said I wasn't sure yet. Maybe a few years if things worked out. She smiled at that. Not big, just polite. People stay because Belmere takes care of its own. Then she adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan and looked past me toward the basketball hoops folded into the gym ceiling. Long as they remember, they belong to Belmere too. I remember nothing, like I understood what she meant. Truth is, I wasn't completely sure what she meant. By January, I owned 3 flannel shirts. That probably sounds insignificant. It did to me too at the time. But I hadn't worn flannel regularly since the late 90s. In Phoenix, most of my clothes were golf polos and lightweight button-downs because everything there either involved air conditioning or pretending heat wasn't happening. In Belmere, everybody dressed like weather might change its mind halfway through the day. At first, I bought one heavy overshirt because Denise said the wind off the lake cut through thinner jackets. Then Mitch mentioned work boots that actually handled ice. Then Randall laughed one morning at the diner and said, "You still dressing like a pharmaceutical rep from Atlanta." He didn't mean anything by it. At least, I don't think he did. But the next week, I drove 40 minutes to a farm supply store outside Carthage and bought darker jeans and a canvas coat I absolutely did not need. After that, nobody joked about Arizona clothes anymore. Small adjustments kept happening like that. I stopped correcting people when they shortened my name from Daniel to Danny, even though nobody had called me Danny since college. I started saying probably instead of I don't know. Started waving first from my truck instead of pretending not to notice people through the windshield. One morning, I caught myself dropping the G off words. Nothing. Morning. Heading. Not intentionally. Just easier. Conversationally. I still told myself I was adapting. That's what moving somewhere new required, right? Everybody adjusts. At least that's how I explained it to myself then. The church thing happened slower. I didn't suddenly become religious or anything. Mostly I started attending because every major piece of information in Belmere seemed to pass through Fellowship Baptist at some point during the week. Weather closures, plumbing recommendations, volunteer sign-ups, whose cousin got arrested in Murfreesboro, which road iced over first during storms. Even if you didn't believe church still functioned like infrastructure. The first time I went, Denise had introduced me to 6 people before I sat down. By the third Sunday, folks had stopped introducing themselves and started talking to me like I already belonged there. A woman handed me a crock-pot without explaining why. Somebody else asked if I could help stack folding chairs after service. Randall waved me into a men's breakfast the following Wednesday like it had been assumed for years. I remember standing in the fellowship hall holding powdered eggs on a paper plate thinking I hadn't actually decided to become part of anything yet. But apparently everybody else already had. Around then I started noticing a man named Walter Reed. Not the hospital, just Walter Reed. 70 maybe. Lived alone near the edge of town past the boat ramp road. People weren't cruel to him. That's important. Belmere wasn't cruel exactly. They just stopped naturally around him. Like water moving around a rock. The first thing I noticed was nobody used his first name warmly. It was always to just Walter Reed in one piece the way people say county clerk or tax office. Then I realized he almost never came up unless somebody needed to explain a delay or inconvenience. Walter Reed still hasn't cleaned that ditch. Walter Reed arguing with the propane company again. Walter Reed says the county line survey's wrong. Stuff like that. One icy morning, I saw him standing alone in Harlan's Hardware waiting at the order counter while everybody else drank free coffee near the heaters. The clerk kept telling him the supply shipment must have gotten mixed up. Walter looked tired more than angry. I remember him glancing around the store like he expected somebody to back him up on something. Nobody did. Later, I asked Randall what the story was there. Randall shrugged. Walter don't really participate much. Apparently, that was explanation enough. A week later, Walter's truck slid halfway into a drainage ditch during freezing rain. I drove past it on the way into town around sunrise. He was trying to wedge cardboard under the rear tire for traction. 3 other trucks passed him before I did. Nobody stopped, not aggressively. Nobody flipped him off or shouted anything. They just kept driving carefully around him like they were late. I almost kept driving too. That's the part that still bothers me a little. Not because I consciously disliked Walter. I barely knew him. But somewhere in my head, I'd already started sorting people into categories. Belmere seemed to understand automatically. Reliable people, participating people, people who showed up, people who didn't. Walter apparently belonged in the second category now. What bothered me later was realizing I already understood the category somehow. Maybe nobody ever had to. I ended up back in my truck onto the shoulder and helping him anyway. Mostly chains and slow rocking movement. Took maybe 15 minutes. He barely spoke during the whole thing. When we finally got the truck loose, he nodded once and said, "Appreciate it." Then, after a pause, he added, "You're still new." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He didn't laugh back. That afternoon at the diner, Randall saw mud splashed up the side of my truck and asked where I'd been. I told him Walter slid off the road near the boat ramp. Randall stirred cream into his coffee a little longer than necessary. That was it. Then he changed the subject to high school basketball. But for the rest of breakfast, something felt slightly out of alignment around the table. Not punishment exactly, just a subtle shift in temperature. And the strange part was I immediately started defending myself in my own head. Not out loud, internally, like he needed help. It was icy. Anybody would have stopped. Except apparently not anybody. A few days later, I realized Mitch hadn't returned my call about borrowing his trailer hitch. Denise still texted, but shorter messages now. At church, one of the men forgot to save me a seat at breakfast, even though they usually did. Small things. Easy to dismiss individually. Still, I noticed all of them. Then one Friday night, I caught myself doing something worse. A young couple from Nashville had moved into the rental house near the pharmacy. They skipped 2 community events back to back and apparently turned down helping at the winter clothing drive. At the diner, somebody mentioned them being a little standoffish. And before I even thought about it carefully, I heard myself say, "Well, people notice effort around here." The second it came out of my mouth, I felt this weird little drop in my stomach. Because it sounded exactly like something Belmere would say. Not me. Or maybe not the version of me that moved there. Nobody reacted strongly. Randall just nodded and kept eating toast. Conversation moved on. But I sat there afterwards, stirring cold coffee, realizing I'd started measuring strangers against rules nobody had ever fully explained to me. And worse, part of me already agreed with them. By February, the town had started talking about Founders Day like it was weather moving in. Everything became before Founders or after Founders. The grocery store put up banners in the windows. Kids painted signs in the high school art room. Fellowship Baptist started collecting folding tables in the gymnasium 2 weeks early. because apparently somebody borrowed 6 of them last year and returned 3 with fish blood still on them. I heard that story 4 separate times from 4 separate people. Founders Day lasted an entire weekend. Parade Friday, lake events Saturday, church supper Sunday night. Belmere treated it less like a festival and more like proof the town still existed. Around then, I started feeling tired in a way sleep didn't really fix. Not physically exactly. More like socially tired. Every week already had shape to it before I even woke up Monday morning. Wednesday breakfast, Friday gathering somewhere, Sunday service, random stop-bys in between. Somebody always needing a hand with fencing or generators or moving feedbacks before rain came. And if you disappeared too long, people noticed fast. One Thursday, I drove 30 minutes north just to sit alone near a river overlook outside county lines. I didn't tell anybody where I was going. I left my phone in the truck and walked trails for almost 3 hours without hearing my name once. Honestly, I felt better almost immediately. Then guilty about feeling better. That part surprised me. When I got back to Belmere after dark, Denise's porch light was still on across the road. She stepped outside before I even killed the engine. "There you are," she said. Not angry, relieved. I told her I'd gone driving. "Well," she said slowly, "folks were wondering." That word again. Folks. Not I was wondering. Folks. The next morning at the diner, Randall asked if everything was all right at home. I said, "Yeah." He nodded. "Heard your truck wasn't around most of the day." Then after a second he added, "Thought maybe you headed back to Arizona for good." People laughed lightly around the counter, including me. But something in my chest tightened anyway. A few days later, Mitch stopped by while I was replacing a porch bulb and asked if I'd signed up for Founders Day volunteer shifts yet. I told him I probably wouldn't do much this year. Why's that? I don't know. Just thinking I might get out of town a couple days. He leaned against the porch rail, looking genuinely confused. "You leaving during Founders maybe." There was a pause long enough I ended up pretending to focus on the screwdriver in my hand. Then Mitch shrugged once. "Thought you were one of us now." He said it casually. No edge to it. After he left, I stayed outside another 20 minutes, messing with the same loose light fixture even after it was already fixed. The weird thing was part of me immediately started trying to justify myself to people who weren't even there. I've got every right to leave town. People travel. Normal adults don't need permission to breathe for a weekend. But Belmere had started making ordinary decisions feel strangely public. The following Sunday after church, Denise asked if I could help organize canned drinks behind the rec hall for Saturday's parade setup. I told her I wasn't sure I'd even be around. This time she didn't answer right away. Then she smiled gently and said, "Well, I guess everybody settles in different." Which didn't sound insulting exactly. Still sat badly with me the rest of the afternoon. By then, even my routines had changed in ways I barely noticed until I stopped moving long enough to think about them. I no longer listen to the podcasts I used to play while driving because people in Belmere mostly listen to local radio, and somehow silence in the truck had started feeling rude to me. I stopped wearing headphones while walking because folks expected conversation if they waved you over. I'd even started parking farther from the diner windows because Randall once joked I looked city nervous sitting where nobody could see me. It was a lot of little adjustments like that. One morning near the end of February, I was sitting at Harlan's around 6:30 before the breakfast rush. Snowmelt dripped steadily off the awning outside. Somebody at the grill dropped a pan loud enough to make two old men glance up from their coffee. Randall asked if I was coming to parade setup Friday. I said maybe. Then Denise asked if I'd signed up for the church supper head count. Then Mitch wanted to know if I could help direct parking near the lake Saturday morning. None of them sounded demanding. That's what kept making the whole thing hard to explain even to myself. Everybody remained kind. Harlan topped off my coffee without asking. Denise brought me homemade banana bread wrapped in foil because she said I looked tired lately. Randall offered me his snow chains if the roads froze again. But sitting there listening to them, I realized something all at once that I probably should have noticed months earlier. At some point, people had stopped asking questions with open-ended answers. Everything became you coming, you helping, you staying, you heading over later. Questions where saying no suddenly felt strange. Nobody ever asked what I actually wanted anymore, not directly. Nobody asked, did I like living there? Was I happy? Did I miss my old life? Did I want quiet? Did I want space? The only question anybody asked was some version of you coming to breakfast, coming to clean up, coming Friday night, coming Sunday, coming by later, coming around eventually. And the worst part was I'd started answering automatically before even checking how I felt. That afternoon, I called my daughter Claire while sitting in the truck outside the pharmacy. We usually talked once every week or two. She lived outside Denver with her fiancé and worked remote for some medical software company I still didn't fully understand. She answered on speaker while walking her dog. At first, we talked normally. Weather, her apartment lease, whether I'd finally fixed the leak under my sink. Then she got quiet for a second and said, "Dad, yeah, you sound different lately." I laughed a little because I honestly thought she meant the accent thing. What more southern non-propos? Just different. Cars hissed past on wet pavement outside the truck. I remember watching somebody load bird seed into the back of an SUV across the street while Claire stayed quiet on the line. Finally, I asked different how another pause. "I don't know," she said. "Smaller maybe." I didn't answer right away, and neither did she. I told people I was heading to Knoxville for a few days. That was the story I used. Just a break. Maybe look at furniture. Maybe visit an old friend from Phoenix who'd moved east a couple years ago. I said different versions depending on who asked. Nobody argued with me about it, which somehow felt worse than if they had. The week before Founders Day, Belmere got unusually warm for March. Snowmelt turned the shoulders muddy along the highway, and the whole town smelled faintly like wet cedar and gasoline. People moved slower in warmer weather there. Longer conversations in parking lots, truck windows down, folding chairs appearing on porches again. I started packing quietly after dinner each night. Not dramatically, just practical things first. Winter clothes into plastic bins. Kitchen stuff wrapped in towels. Bathroom drawer junk I kept forgetting I owned. Every now and then I'd stop halfway through a box because I couldn't remember if I was leaving temporarily or not. Part of me kept waiting for the feeling to pass. Like maybe I was just overwhelmed or tired or going through some delayed divorce thing people in Belmere had accidentally interrupted before I finished processing it. Then, Thursday morning, I walked into Harlan's and realized I was rehearsing versions of myself, depending on which table I stopped at. With Randall, I talked local road work. With Denise, I talked church schedules. With Mitch, I talked weather and generators. By the time I got back to my truck afterward, I couldn't remember the last conversation I'd had there that hadn't involved adjusting myself slightly first. That scared me more than anything specific anybody had done. Founders Day banners went up Friday afternoon. Red, white, and blue ribbons tied around parking meters downtown. Somebody painted directional signs toward the lake in the school colors. At dusk, a group of teenagers tested parade speakers near the courthouse, and old country music echoed halfway across Main Street. I watched all of it from the gas station parking lot while eating peanuts out of a paper bag because I suddenly didn't want to walk through the middle of town anymore. Not because anybody was mean. Mostly because I knew exactly how every conversation would go. You helping tomorrow, you coming tonight, you heading over later. And I was tired of answering in ways that made other people comfortable before I answered, honestly. That night, Denise knocked around 8:30, carrying another casserole dish balanced against her hip. She looked past me into the half-packed living room almost immediately. I hadn't planned on telling anyone yet. She didn't say anything for a few seconds, just stood there holding the dish. Finally, she asked, "You heading out sooner than expected, probably before sunrise." Oh, that was all. Then she nodded once like she was about to say something else and handed me the casserole anyway. Beef stew this time. Still hot through the towel. I remember feeling this sudden awful urge to explain myself carefully enough that she wouldn't feel hurt. Which was strange because I was the one leaving. She glanced toward the stacked boxes near the hallway and said, "Well, guess everybody finds their place eventually." Same sentence she'd used months earlier when I told her I didn't attend church. Only now it sounded tired instead of hopeful. After she left, I ate the stew standing at the counter again like I had the first night in Belmere. Around midnight, I noticed somebody had left a pie on the porch. No note. Just apple pie wrapped in foil with a plastic grocery bag tied around it because rain had started sometime after 10. I never found out who brought it. Around 4:45 the next morning, I carried the last box out to the truck. Town was still dark except for the pharmacy cross glowing green down the road. Somebody's porch wind chime rattled softly every few seconds. When I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed the gas gauge sitting full. I know for a fact it hadn't been full the night before. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten filling it earlier in the week. Then I saw the receipt tucked under the wiper blade. No name, just a timestamp from Miller's station at 11:12 p.m. $43 and some change. I sat there staring at the receipt longer than made sense. That was the part that made leaving difficult. Not manipulation, not cruelty, not exposure. If Belmere had tried to control me directly, I probably would have left angry months earlier. Instead, people kept taking care of me in ways that made it harder to tell where gratitude ended and obligation started. And I don't think most of them even realized they were doing it. Because Belmere never felt fake exactly. The kindness was real. The casseroles were real. The generator was real. The firewood, the filled gas tank, the people checking whether you made it home during storms. All real. But somewhere along the line, I'd started shaping myself around maintaining access to that warmth. Smaller opinions, smaller preferences, smaller silences. I left just before 5. No goodbye tour, no speech, no dramatic ending where anybody suddenly understood me better. By the time the sun started coming up over the hills, I was already 30 miles outside Belmere, heading east on Highway 70. At a gas station near the county line, I pulled over for coffee because I'd barely slept. The place had fluorescent lights bright enough to hurt a little. Somebody in a hunting jacket was arguing quietly about scratch-off tickets near the register. Coffee tasted burnt. I sat there alone by the window for maybe 20 minutes. And somewhere during that 20 minutes, I realized something strange. Nobody in the building knew my name. Nobody knew where I'd been yesterday. Nobody knew what church I attended. Nobody knew whether I showed up for cleanup days or parade setup or Wednesday breakfast. Nobody was expecting me anywhere that night. For the first time in months, I felt completely unobserved. The relief hit first. Then, almost right behind it, this sharp little loneliness I still don't know how to describe properly. I remember looking out through the gas station window at the highway while trucks rolled past in the dark, wet morning, and thinking about Belmere waking up without me there. Denise probably noticing the driveway empty. Randall asking somebody if I left already. Founders Day still happening exactly on schedule. And honestly, I think Belmere will keep taking care of people for a very long time. Long as people keep showing up for each other, I guess. Maybe that's true everywhere. I still don't know. A year later, I stopped for gas in another town outside Asheville and saw a volunteer sign-up board beside the coffee station. I remember staring at it longer than made sense. Then the cashier asked if I wanted my receipt, and I said no. Thanks too fast, like I'd been caught doing something embarrassing.